Mr. Stephen Krashen from the University of Southern California has a well-known expertise in the field of linguistics. He specializes in theories of language acquisition and development. Much of his recent research has involved the study of non-English and bilingual language acquisition. The acquisition learning distinction is the most fundamental of the 5 hypotheses in Krashen's theory and the most widely known among linguists and language teachers. Krashen's theory of second language acquisition consists of 5 main hypotheses: the acquisition learning hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, the input hypothesis, the affective filter hypothesis, and the natural order hypothesis. The acquisition learning distinction, as I said, is the most fundamental of the 5 hypotheses in Krashen's theory and the most widely known among linguists and language teachers. So according to Krashen, there are 2 different systems of foreign language performance. First is the acquired system, and the second is the learned system. The acquired system or acquisition is the product of a subconscious process very similar to the process children undergo when they acquire their first language. It requires meaningful interaction in the target language, natural communication in which speakers are concentrated not in the form of their utterances but in the communicative act. However, on the other hand, the learned system or learning is the product of formal instruction and a conscious process, which results in conscious knowledge about the language. For example, knowledge of grammar rules. A deductive approach in teacher-centered setting produces learning, while an inductive approach in a student-centered setting leads to acquisition. According to Krashen, learning is less important than acquisition. When we think of language learning, we tend to understand 2 clearly distinct concepts. One involves receiving information about the language, transforming it into knowledge through intellectual effort, and storing it through memorization. The other involves developing the skill of interacting with foreigners to understand them and speak their language. The first concept is called language learning, while the other is referred to as language acquisition. These are separate ideas, and we will show that neither is a natural consequence of the other. Language acquisition refers to the process of natural assimilation involving intuition and subconscious learning. It is the product of real interactions between people in environments of the target language and culture where the learner is an active player. It is similar to the way children learn their native tongue, a process that produces functional skill in the spoken language without theoretical knowledge. It develops familiarity with the phonetic characteristics of the language as well as its structure and vocabulary, and is responsible for oral understanding, the capability for creative communication, and for the identification of cultural values. The acquisition approach praises the communicative act and develops self-confidence in the learner. An example of this would be adolescents and young adults that live abroad for a year in an exchange program, or they are exchange students, often attaining near native fluency while knowing little about the language. They have a good pronunciation without a notion of phonology, don't know what the perfect tense is, modal or phrasal verbs are, but they intuitively recognize and know how to use all the structures. That's because of the interaction and exposure to that language in the certain place that they live. The concept of language learning is linked to the traditional approach to the study of languages, and today is still generally practiced in high schools worldwide. Perks of language learning would be the following. Attention is focused on the language in its written form, and the objective is for the student to understand the structure and rules of the language, whose parts are dissected and analyzed. And also, the task requires intellectual effort and deductive reasoning. And also, the form is of greater importance than communication. Teaching and learning are technical and based on a syllabus. One studies the theory in the absence of the practice, one values the correct and represses the incorrect. Error correction is constant, leaving little room for spontaneity. The student will be taught how to form interrogative and negative sentences, will memorize irregular verbs, study modal verbs, learn how to form the perfect tense, and etc., but hardly ever masters the use of these structures in conversation. An example would be innumerable graduates in Brazil with arts degrees in English. They are certified teachers with knowledge about the language and its literature, but able to communicate in English only with poor pronunciation, limited vocabulary, and lacking awareness of the target culture. Although they've mastered all the structures and the rules of grammar and language, but since they lack the interaction or exposure to the real thing, so that's what they were lacking. Although you have learned a specific language, you have to be aware of the target culture and to be able to interact using the language that you have learned. The second one is the monitor hypothesis, in which it discusses how learning and acquisition are related and how the latter affects the former. The application of the learned grammar is seen in the monitoring function. Krashen claims that the acquisition system initiates utterances, while the learning system acts as a monitor or an editor. When three particular requirements are satisfied, the monitor performs planning, editing, and correcting functions. There is enough time available to someone learning a second language. They concentrate on appearance or consider correctness. They understand the law. It seems that the contribution of conscious learning to second language proficiency is rather constrained. Krashen claims that the monitor's function is quite limited, consisting primarily of correcting speech that deviates from normal and making speech appear more polished. Krashen also suggests that there is individual variation among language learners with regards to monitor use. He distinguishes those learners that use the monitor all the time or the overusers, those learners who have not learned or prefer not to use their conscious knowledge, which are the underusers, and those learners that use the monitor appropriately, or the optimal users. An evaluation of the person's psychological profile can help to determine to what group they belong. Usually, extroverts are underusers, while introverts and perfectionists are overusers. Lack of self-confidence is frequently related to the overuse of the monitor. Krashen's effort to explain how a learner obtains a second language, how second language acquisition occurs, is known as the input hypothesis. The input hypothesis does not address learning, simply acquisition. This theory states that when a learner gets second language input, that is one level above their current level of linguistic proficiency, they improve and move along the natural order of language acquisition. If a student is, for instance, at stage I, acquisition occurs when the learner is exposed to comprehensible input, which is at level I+1. In order to ensure that each learner receives some I+1 input appropriate for his or her current stage of linguistic competence, Krashen contends that natural communicative input is the key to designing a syllabus. This is because not all of the learners can be at the same level of linguistic competence at the same time. According to Krashen, a number of effective variables facilitate but do not cause second language acquisition. This idea is embodied by the affective filter hypothesis, which is our fourth hypothesis. These elements include drive, confidence in oneself, anxiousness, and personality qualities. So, according to Krashen, second language learning is more likely to be successful in students who are highly motivated, self-assured, have a positive view of themselves, are less anxious, and are extroverted. Low self-esteem, anxiety, introversion, low motivation, and inhibition can all increase the affective filter and create a mental block that inhibits intelligible input from being utilized for learning. In other words, language learning is hampered while the filter is high. On the other hand, for acquisition to occur, positive effect alone is not sufficient, even though it is important. And the last one is the natural order theory, which is supported by research that suggested the acquisition of grammatical structures occurs in a predictable and natural order. Some grammatical structures for a given language are more likely to be learned early on than others. Although individual language learners' agreement in the studies was not always 100%, there were statistically significant similarities that supported the existence of a natural order of language acquisition. So this order appeared to be unaffected by the learner's age, L1 background, and exposure conditions. Krashen notes, however, that the consequence of the natural order theory is not that the syllabus for a language school should be based in the order discovered in the studies. In fact, he disapproves of grammatical sequencing when language acquisition is the main objective. Dr. Krashen claims that studying a language's structure might have general educational benefits and ideals that high schools and universities might want to incorporate into their language curricula. However, any advantages will most likely depend on the learner's prior language proficiency. It should also be made clear that language analysis, the creation of rules, differentiating irregularities, and the teaching of intricate language-related facts are not language teaching, but rather language appreciation or linguistics, which does not result in communicative ability. Only when the students are engaged in the subject and the target language is employed as a medium of instruction can the teaching of grammar lead to language acquisition and competency or proficiency. So when this happens, it frequently happens that both the teachers and the students are convinced that learning formal grammar is crucial for learning a second language, and the teacher is proficient enough to explain things to the students in the target language. In other words, the teacher's speech satisfies the criteria for understandable input, and perhaps with the help of the students, the classroom will turn into a conducive learning atmosphere. Additionally, there is a lack of filtering in the explanation language because students typically focus on the content or what is being discussed rather than the medium.